Well, an important moment right now for both Canada and Alberta in particular as a new federal government gets set to tackle, hopefully, some of the major economic challenges facing our country, exacerbated, of course, by the aggressive tariff approach of the U.S. president. But still, the Business Council of Alberta believes that bold action can go a long way in strengthening Canada's and Alberta's economy and future. Joining us now is Adam Legge, president of the Business Council of Alberta, businesscouncilab.com. Adam, so great to have you with us here. Welcome to the program.
Great to be on, Rob. Thanks so much.
Well, first of all, let's talk a bit about some of the, I don't know if it's uncertainty hanging over Alberta, but I know there's some concern with talk of separation or a possible referendum that can have an impact on investors' certainty or the climate in Alberta. I mean, certainly at the same time, I think Alberta's got some legitimate concerns with federal policy. What are your worries or concerns here?
Well, I think at the core of it, Rob, it's really about fairness and functionality of the federation. Alberta, and frankly, I would argue that many of the Western provinces have really not had the opportunities to play to their strengths that we would like to, and that's predominantly in the natural resource sector. Beefs with Ottawa and the federation have been since time immemorial, and we've seen everything from challenges of separation, not only in Quebec, but also in Eastern Canada throughout history. But I think at the core of this one in Alberta, it really is about, does Alberta have a fair deal in the Federation? Is Alberta being recognized for its contributions? And so I think the concerns and frustrations of Albertans are A, real, and B, quite fair. And so what we would like to see, frankly, is Ottawa recognize that Alberta has been constrained. I would argue both BC and Saskatchewan and Manitoba have also been constrained in many ways, and to find a new way to do that so that Alberta stays in the Federation. We don't want to see any separation of Alberta from Canada. We believe that Canada is stronger with Alberta in it, and vice versa. But if you look at what drives investor uncertainty, this is definitely a factor. But it's at part of a list that is quite long about investor uncertainty, and frankly, some of the challenges that Ottawa has put in place with respect to regulatory delays, emissions caps, clean electricity regulations are also in and of themselves drivers of investor uncertainty. And so I would argue also that this latest investor uncertainty issue of separation discussion is the result of a whole other long list of things that drive investor uncertainty, not only in Alberta, but in Canada.
Yeah. Well, and I think as we talk about challenges and opportunities, I mean, here's an example because, it's not just about Ottawa giving Alberta something at the expense of somewhere else, right? There's a real opportunity for a win-win here. The kinds of policies we talk about in unleashing Canada's economy, that applies to a lot of what we're talking about with regard to Alberta, doesn't it?
Totally, Robbie, and I think you really characterize it well. That what really would enable Alberta to do more and contribute more are not about trade-offs with the federation. We're not asking any other province to forego economic opportunities so that Alberta can grow its energy production, or that BC can grow its energy production, or that we can get those products to either the West Coast or across Canada in an east-west pipeline. All of those create net positives and net adds from an economic standpoint for the rest of the country.
So you're going to be in Ottawa next week. And of course, we've got a speech from the throne. We're going to see what this new government's going to lay out in terms of their vision for addressing all of this, both in terms, then, I guess, of what message are you bringing to the nation's capital, and what message are you hoping to bring back with you?
First and foremost, what we really want to see from the federal government is that they are a champion of the natural resource sector. We think that the role of a prime minister and a natural resource minister should be the chief champions and advocates for the resources that we have as a country, and to enable that to not only be shared with the rest of Canada, but shared with the rest of the world if they're in need and they have demand and they're willing to pay good market prices for it. We haven't had that in a long time. And in fact, we've actually turned world leaders away who've come to our shores asking us for our resources, and they've gone home empty-handed. We can't do that anymore. We have to be sharing these resources with the world. So be vocal champions and advocates for this opportunity in the country. The second is, let's have pragmatic environmental policy. None of our members or none of the industry want to be doing any harm or damage to the environment. In fact, they're trying to do as much as they can to preserve and protect and reduce emissions and leave landscapes in pristine condition post resource development. But we've got a constant layering of policy, whether it's Bill C-69, C-48, oil and gas emissions caps, clean electricity regulations, greenwashing provisions, that all that does is create confusion, overlay and overlap, and a deterrent to investment. So in fact, the companies that want to invest in emissions reduction technology, shockingly, Rob, when the Competition Bureau did a call for feedback on their draft guidelines on the greenwashing provisions, it was the Environment and Climate Change Canada Department of the federal government that said your own greenwashing provisions are making it hard for companies to attract investment and actually reduce emissions. The irony is not lost on me, Rob. I hope it isn't lost on anyone else about how a federal environment department is actually critiquing the greenwashing provisions. I think that's something that people should pay attention to. Third would be is making sure that Indigenous reconciliation and participation is at top of the agenda for all of these projects. And we've seen tremendous opportunities for Indigenous nations, not only to benefit from project development, but now with equity participation through the Indigenous Opportunities Corporation here in Alberta, a federal loan guarantee program. They're able to actually have multi-generational equity positions to gain and realize the potential of these projects. So there's a real need to make sure that that happens in all projects going forward across the country. And then finally, let's make it easier to build projects. Let's reduce the regulatory burden. Let's make it more certain, more predictable, more time-bound, and less open to political interference. So those are the key asks that we're having with the federal government when we go to Ottawa next week. In fact, we're going with our counterparts from the business councils of BC, Manitoba, and the Saskatchewan Chamber to do a united call for a more focused effort on natural resources in the country.
Yeah. And I mean, how the environment fits into that. And I think the federal government, and understandably so, they're not going to abandon that as a priority. I mean, maybe carbon capture, utilization, and storage, maybe that's an area where there's real room for cooperation between Alberta and Ottawa and still keeping the environment as a priority. How do we, balance all of that? And I think maybe still understand where the feds are coming from on that side of things.
Absolutely. There's a host of technologies and opportunities from emissions reduction, carbon capture. But when you've got a policy environment that frankly just layers on top of itself such that you can't even get support for investing in carbon capture and storage, if the federal government's own policies are deterring companies from investing in that, and the Environment and Climate Change Department is saying themselves it's a deterrent to investing in emissions reduction technology, there's a big problem. And so we're advocating that they stick to a specific approach of carbon policy. It's not layered, it's clear, it's simple, it attracts investment in emissions reduction, and that we can get these projects going as opposed to the investment going elsewhere.
In terms of the kind of the dark cloud of tariffs or trade war, and maybe things are diffusing a little bit, at least there's been some positive signs, but I mean, if we end up back in a situation with tariffs imposed on Canada, I just wonder how much can we overcome that? So are we talking about changes in policies that are just about mitigating a bad situation, or is it possible still to overcome some of those negative impacts?
Well, I think the ideal scenario is that the USMCA or CUSMA agreement is reviewed and renegotiated in good faith, and we kind of put all of this behind us. Now, there's a whole global recession concern as a result of things. But as you say, we've seen some of the pressure taken off on China and other countries. So we're optimistic that cooler heads in the U.S. will prevail, and they'll recognize that despite the president's rhetoric, they do need our oil and gas, they do need our autos, they do need our critical minerals, and so that they'll come at it from a standpoint of trying to preserve and keep that relationship going. But I think what it also has done is made Canadians aware of the vulnerability that we have with so much of our trade tied to the U.S. And so I think on a parallel track, we can't abandon the notion of things like reducing interprovincial trade barriers or finding new markets and building new trade infrastructure to get us to non-U.S. markets so we have a broader, more diverse trade basket. But I think the combination of some decent outcome on the USMCA, which continues to enable our goods to flow, reducing interprovincial trade barriers, and then finding new markets that will put Canada in a better position than we were going into, frankly, the gut punch that was the president back in November talking about dealing with these tariff situation, so that we can be far more independent. We can be far more self-sufficient and less hemmed to the decisions of the U.S. So I think we can overcome things, Rob. It'll take some good negotiating on the Canadian side and some strategic investments on the Canadian
Yeah.
side.
It's also the issue of immigration. I know you wrote about that recently for the Hub, because I think most people would agree that this has not been managed well. But I think at the same time, if it is managed well, there's real opportunity for Canada for this to be an advantage for Canada. So how do we address that, and where do we still find where there's an advantage for Canada when it comes to smart immigration policy?
Well, you're right. Canada has long had a tremendous history of welcoming people to our shores and having them contribute in a positive way to the future of the country. Unfortunately, we've taken our eye off the ball in terms of how we evaluate the criteria that will pick the best and the brightest around the world to come to Canada. We lost track of the numbers when it came to, say, the international students and the temporary foreign workers, such that they were really putting pressure on some domestic markets, which I think turned the support for immigration around to record lows. But I think if we get some things right, first and foremost, it's about picking immigrants that are needed for the workforce, and a better match of skills. So the example we always use is that based on the scoring system, someone who has a PhD in Latin will get higher score than a heavy duty mechanic. Now, I can't sell a PhD in Latin to any of my members, but I will have people lined up out the door to get a heavy duty mechanic. So we need to change how we're scoring the people. We need to get them in the jobs and get their credentials recognized faster. The accrediting bodies are taking far too long to get people in their skilled trades and skilled jobs, whereas you have the ubiquitous doctor driving an Uber here when they could be in the medical system providing healthcare. And then finally, settling people appropriately so that they're set up for success, and whether that's English language training, getting them in as quickly as possible instead of waiting 1 or 2 years to get language training, and making sure that the monies flow to settlement agencies as a new immigrant moves throughout Canada. They may pick, say, Montreal as their first port of entry, but they then may move to Edmonton or to Calgary or to Regina, but the money doesn't follow them. So those agencies are being challenged to keep up with the demand for some of those more popular cities in the prairie provinces compared to some of the bigger cities. So we can do it, Rob. We have all of the knowledge and the ideas that we know that we need to make changes. We just have to have the political will to do so.
Yeah. So big picture, Adam, I mean, we talked about the political risk, the economic risk of the status quo. There's a real need, and I think at the same time, a real hunger for some change, some bold leadership. I think you look at the recent federal election. I mean, both of the main parties certainly talked in those terms. So, I mean, how optimistic are you that we're ready to meet this moment?
Well, I'm cautiously optimistic. I hear good words from the Prime Minister that he wants Canada to be the strongest economy in the G7. I mean, finally, a Prime Minister that's talking about the economy, and one that knows the importance of having a strong economy to attract investment, to create jobs and create growth, and frankly, prosperity and well-being across the country. To paraphrase Premier Wab Kinew, the economy pulls the social cart in terms of how we are able to deliver our social services in Canada. So we need a strong economy to deliver the things that we hold dear. I'm optimistic. Things like energy superpower are music to our ears, but we have to see what that is done in terms of action. Words are very easy to say, but we need to see action that's actually going to show that the Prime Minister and federal government are focused on the economy, they're focused on growth, they're focused on investment, and that they'll do whatever they need to do to make sure that we can get to that level, because we are at the bottom of the G7. We're at the bottom of the OECD in terms of outlooks for economic activity. And unless we chart a different course in terms of policy, about resources, about trade, about innovation, about immigration, we're not going to get there. So we need to see action in addition to the language.
We'll be hoping for some positive signals next week. Of course, as mentioned, you'll be in Ottawa as well. Much more at businesscouncilab.com. Adam, really appreciate the insight, the perspective. Thank you so much for making some time for us here.
Thanks so much, Rob.